An ordinary palace waitress always ignored the grumpy night guard, but a moonlit night revealed his true identity. He was a lonely vampire king. He chose that waitress as his queen, and both of their lives changed forever. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places. I remember the night it all changed, when a tired waitress and a silent night guard crossed paths in the palace's shadowed halls. The palace kitchen was always warm, filled with the scent of fresh bread and the low hum of servants' laughter. But tonight the air felt heavier, as if the moon itself was holding its breath. Elena, the youngest waitress, moved quickly between tables, her apron stained with berry juice and her patience worn thin. She was used to the nobles, sharp words, and the endless demands, but tonight it was the new night guard who tested her nerves. He stood in the corner, tall and still, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his cap, never speaking, never smiling. Every time she passed, she felt his gaze, cold, distant, almost ancient. She rolled her eyes as she set down a tray, muttering under her breath about grumpy men and their silent judgments. But when she glanced back, she caught a flicker of something in his eyes, a sadness so deep it made her chest ache. For a moment the world seemed to slow, the laughter fading into a hush. She wondered who he was, why he chose to stand alone in the shadows, and what sorrow he carried behind that stone-cold mask. Later, as the palace emptied and the moonlight spilled through the stained glass, Elena found herself alone in the grand hall, sweeping up crumbs. The night guard lingered by the window, his silhouette framed by silver light. She hesitated, then spoke softly, "You don't have to stand alone all night, you know." Her voice trembled, unsure if she was brave or foolish. He turned, and for the first time she saw his face, pale, beautiful, and marked by centuries of loneliness. His eyes, deep as midnight, met hers with a silent plea. "Sometimes," he whispered, voice barely more than a breath, "loneliness is safer than hope." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Elena's heart pounded, torn between fear and compassion. She took a step closer, the air thick with unspoken secrets. But before she could speak again, a sudden gust of wind slammed the windows open, scattering petals across the marble floor. The night guard recoiled from the moonlight, his form flickering, shadows twisting around him. Elena gasped, frozen in place as she realized the truth. The man before her was not just a guard, but something far older, far more broken, and perhaps far more in need of kindness than anyone she had ever known. The hall fell silent, the only sound her own heartbeat, as she faced the impossible choice: run from the darkness or reach out to the lonely king within it. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the night guard, no, the vampire king, stood trembling in the moonlight, his eyes wide with a pain she couldn't name. The petals danced around his feet, and for a heartbeat, he looked less like a monster and more like a man lost in a world that no longer belonged to him. She wanted to run, every instinct screaming for her to flee the impossible, but something in his eyes, an ancient sorrow, a silent plea, held her in place. The palace, so grand and golden by day, now felt like a cage of secrets. Elena's hands shook as she gripped her broom, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" she asked, her words trembling with fear and something softer, too. He turned away, hiding his face in the shadows. "No one you should know," he said, his voice rough with regret. "I am only a memory here, a shadow among the living." His words echoed through the empty hall, and Elena felt the weight of centuries pressing in around them. She remembered the stories the old cooks told, of a king who vanished, of a curse that haunted the palace. But those were just tales, weren't they? Yet here he stood, real and broken, more alone than anyone she had ever met. Elena's heart ached for him, even as fear prickled at her skin. She took a careful step forward, her courage trembling but real. "You don't have to be alone," she said, her voice steadier now. "Not tonight." The words surprised even her, but she meant them. She saw the way his shoulders tensed, as if he wanted to believe her but couldn't. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment the mask of the night guard fell away. She saw the king beneath, the longing, the regret, the hope he tried so hard to bury. "Kindness is dangerous," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's a light that calls the darkness closer." A sudden crash echoed from the far end of the hall. Elena jumped, her heart racing. The king's eyes flashed with fear, not for himself but for her. "You must go," he said urgently, his voice trembling with a desperate protectiveness. "There are things in this palace that wake when the moon is full, things that would hurt you to reach me." Elena hesitated, torn between the safety of running and the courage to stay. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, the air colder, as if the palace itself was listening. She looked at the king, her heart pounding, and realized that his loneliness was not just his own, it was a curse that threatened to swallow them both. As the footsteps drew closer, Elena faced the darkness, her choice hanging in the balance. Would she run from the truth or stand beside the king who had already lost everything? The answer waited in the shadows as the night grew colder and the danger crept ever closer. The footsteps echoed louder, each one a drumbeat of dread in the marble corridors. Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed herself against the wall, her eyes darting between the vampire king and the darkness at the end of the hall. The king's face was tight with worry, his hands clenched at his sides as if he was fighting the urge to shield her with his own body. A figure emerged from the shadows, a palace guard, but his eyes were wild, his movements strange, as if he were sleepwalking through a nightmare. He muttered words Elena couldn't understand, his voice thick with fear. The king stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding, his voice low and gentle. "Return to your post, old friend. The night is not for you." The guard blinked, confusion flickering across his face. For a moment, it seemed as if the king's words might break whatever spell held him. But then the guard's gaze snapped to Elena and his expression twisted with terror. "He's cursed," the guard cried, stumbling backward. "He'll bring ruin to us all." Elena's breath caught. She saw the pain flash in the king's eyes, a wound reopened by old accusations. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he bowed his head, accepting the blame as if it were a familiar cloak. The guard fled, his footsteps fading into the distance, leaving only silence and the heavy weight of shame. Elena stepped closer, her fear replaced by a fierce protectiveness. "Why do you let them say such things?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and compassion. "Why do you hide in the shadows when you could show them who you really are?" The king looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because hope is a dangerous gift," he said softly. "Every time I reach for it, I lose someone I care about. It's safer to be the monster they fear than the king they might love and lose." His words struck Elena like a storm. She saw for the first time the depth of his loneliness, not just a man cursed by darkness, but a king who had chosen exile to protect those he loved. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to promise him he wasn't alone. But before she could move, the great clock in the tower struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the palace like a warning. The king flinched, his body tensing as if the sound itself was a threat. "You must go," he whispered urgently. "Midnight is when the curse is strongest. If you stay, you'll be trapped here with me forever." Elena's heart twisted with fear and longing. She looked at the king, torn between the safety of escape and the courage to stay. The moonlight painted his face with silver sorrow, and she knew that whatever choice she made, nothing would ever be the same. As the final chime faded, Elena stood at the edge of the hall, her decision hanging in the air, the king's fate, and her own balanced on a single fragile moment. Elena's hands trembled as the last echo of the clock faded into silence. The palace seemed to hold its breath, every shadow stretching longer, every whisper of wind colder. She could feel the weight of the king's gaze, heavy with centuries of longing and regret. He stood so still, as if afraid that even the smallest movement might shatter the fragile hope between them. She wanted to run, to escape the curse and the sorrow that clung to these ancient walls, but something deeper held her in place, a quiet courage she didn't know she possessed. Elena took a slow breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her words trembling but true. "No one deserves to be alone forever." The king's eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment the mask of the night guard slipped away and she saw the man beneath, the king who had once loved his people, who had lost everything to darkness. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air, uncertain and afraid. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "The curse is not just mine, it touches anyone who stays." Elena stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Then let it touch me," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "I'd rather face the darkness with you than run from it alone." The words surprised even her, but she meant them with every part of her soul. A sudden wind swept through the hall, swirling petals and dust around them. The moonlight grew brighter, casting strange patterns on the marble floor. The king's shadow stretched and twisted, flickering with the shape of wings. He closed his eyes, fighting back tears. "You are braver than any knight I have ever known," he whispered. But as the clock's final chime faded, a cold, invisible force swept through the palace. Elena felt it wrap around her, chilling her to the bone. The king staggered, his face contorted in pain. "It's starting," he gasped. "The curse, it's waking." Elena reached for him, her fingers brushing his hand. In that instant, a surge of memories flooded her mind, visions of the king's past, his laughter, his love, his endless nights of sorrow. She saw the moment he was cursed, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the centuries of solitude. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the true cost of his loneliness. The king fell to his knees, his strength failing. Elena knelt beside him, cradling his hand in hers. "I'm here," she whispered fiercely. "I won't let you face this alone." But as the curse tightened its grip, the palace itself seemed to shift and groan, the walls trembling with ancient magic. The moonlight flickered, and for a heartbeat, Elena saw the king's true form, a creature of darkness and beauty, both terrifying and heartbreakingly human. The world spun around her, and Elena clung to the king's hand, refusing to let go. But as the shadows closed in, she wondered if her courage would be enough to save them both, or if she had doomed herself to share his endless night. The palace doors slammed shut, sealing their fate as the darkness rose to claim them. The palace groaned under the weight of the curse, its golden halls twisting into a labyrinth of shadows. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps as she clung to the king's hand, her knuckles white with fear and determination. The world around them blurred, the familiar warmth of the kitchen and the laughter of servants replaced by a cold, echoing silence. It was as if the palace itself had been swallowed by the night. The king's form flickered between man and myth, his eyes shining with a desperate, ancient sorrow. "You should not have stayed," he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. "This darkness was never meant for you." But Elena shook her head, her resolve burning brighter than her fear. No one should carry this alone, not even a king. As they moved through the shifting corridors, memories pressed in on Elena, visions not her own but his. She saw the king as a young man, full of hope and laughter, beloved by his people. She saw the night he was betrayed, the moment the curse took hold, and the endless years of isolation that followed. Each memory was a wound, and Elena felt the ache of his loneliness as if it were her own. They reached the heart of the palace, a grand hall now draped in shadow. The moonlight struggled to pierce the darkness, casting trembling patterns on the floor. In the center of the room stood a mirror, tall and ancient, its surface swirling with mist. The king recoiled from it, pain etched deep in his features. "This is where it began," he said, his voice barely audible. "The curse was bound to my reflection. Every night I am forced to face what I have lost." Elena stepped forward, her reflection wavering beside his in the glass. She saw herself, afraid, yes, but also brave, her hand still holding his. "You are not lost," she said softly. "You are still here, and so am I." The mirror trembled, the mist inside swirling faster. The king's shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for Elena, but she stood her ground. "What if the curse can be broken?" she asked, hope flickering in her eyes. "What if it takes someone willing to see you, not as a monster, but as a man?" The king's eyes filled with tears, centuries of longing and regret shining in their depths. "No one has ever tried," he whispered. "No one has ever stayed." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled beneath her touch, and a surge of warmth spread through the room. For the first time, the darkness seemed to hesitate, uncertain in the face of her courage. But as the light grew, the shadows fought back, swirling around the king with renewed fury. He cried out, falling to his knees as the curse tightened its grip. Elena knelt beside him, her arms around his shoulders, refusing to let go. The mirror cracked, a single line splitting the glass, and the palace trembled with the force of ancient magic. Elena's heart pounded with hope and terror, knowing that everything would change in the next moment, if only she could hold on. The darkness screamed, the mirror shuddered, and the fate of the king and Elena hung by a thread suspended between night and dawn. The mirror's crack widened, splintering the swirling mist into shards of light and shadow. Elena held the king tightly, her arms trembling but unyielding. The darkness raged around them, howling with the voices of centuries, regret, anger, sorrow, all the pain the king had carried alone. But Elena's courage was a quiet, steady flame refusing to be snuffed out. The king's body shook with the force of the curse, his face twisted in agony. "You must let go," he gasped, his voice raw with fear. "If you stay, the darkness will take you too." But Elena shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I see you," she whispered fiercely. "Not the monster, not the curse. I see the man who still hopes, who still loves. I won't let you disappear." As her words echoed through the hall, the mirror's surface began to glow, the crack pulsing with golden light. The shadows recoiled, shrinking from the warmth of Elena's compassion. The king's eyes met hers, and for the first time, hope flickered in their depths, a hope he had not dared to feel in centuries. The palace trembled, the walls groaning as if waking from a long nightmare. The darkness surged one last time, desperate to reclaim its hold. Elena closed her eyes, holding the king's hand to her heart. "You are not alone," she whispered, pouring every ounce of love and kindness she had into the words. "Not anymore." A blinding light burst from the mirror, flooding the hall with warmth. The shadows screamed and vanished, swept away like mist at sunrise. The curse shattered, its grip broken by the strength of Elena's heart. The king collapsed into her arms, his body finally free, his face wet with tears of relief and disbelief. Slowly, the palace began to change. The cold, haunted halls filled with gentle light. The air grew warm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and fresh bread. The doors creaked open, and the first rays of dawn spilled across the marble floor. The king looked at Elena, his eyes shining with gratitude and wonder. "You saved me," he whispered, voice trembling with awe. "You saw me when I could not see myself." Elena smiled through her tears, her heart full. "No one should be alone in the dark," she said softly, "not even a king." As the sun rose, the palace came alive with hope. Servants and nobles awoke to a new day, unaware of the miracle that had unfolded in the night. But Elena and the king knew they had faced the darkness together and found the light. Hand in hand, they stepped into the morning, their hearts forever changed. The lonely vampire king was lonely no more, and the girl who dared to stay had become his queen, not by royal decree, but by the quiet, unstoppable power of kindness and love. And so, in the place where shadows once ruled, a new story began, one of courage, compassion, and the promise that even the deepest night can give way to dawn. Sunlight poured through the palace windows, painting the marble floors with gold. For the first time in centuries, laughter echoed through the halls, not the nervous, hurried laughter of servants, but the bright, genuine sound of hope returning. Elena and the king walked side by side, their hands still entwined, as the world around them seemed to breathe again. The king's face was different now, softer, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. He paused in the garden where roses bloomed wild and free and turned to Elena with wonder in his eyes. "I never believed I would see the sun again," he said, his voice trembling with gratitude. "You gave me back my life." Elena smiled, brushing a petal from his shoulder. "You gave yourself back to the world," she replied gently. "All I did was remind you that you were never truly lost." But as the palace awoke to joy, not everyone understood the miracle. Whispers spread among the nobles, rumors of curses broken, of a king who had walked in darkness and a servant girl who had changed his fate. Some were afraid, clinging to old fears and stories. Others watched with curiosity, uncertain if they could trust this new beginning. The king saw their doubt and felt a familiar ache. He knew that forgiveness would not come easily, that trust would take time to rebuild. But he stood tall, no longer hiding in the shadows. "Let them see me as I am," he said quietly to Elena. "If I am to be their king again, it must be with honesty and humility." Elena squeezed his hand, pride shining in her eyes. "You are not alone anymore. We'll face whatever comes together." As the day wore on, the king gathered the palace staff and nobles in the great hall. He spoke not as a ruler above them, but as a man who had suffered and learned. He told the truth of his curse, of his mistakes, and of the kindness that had saved him. Some wept, others turned away, but many listened, hearts opening, if only a little, to the possibility of change. When he finished, the hall was silent. Then, slowly, a single servant stepped forward, a woman who had once feared the night. She bowed her head and offered a simple loaf of bread, a symbol of trust and welcome. Others followed one by one until the king and Elena stood surrounded by a circle of hope. But as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the palace, Elena felt a chill in the air, a reminder that not all darkness had vanished. In the farthest corner of the hall, a stranger watched with cold, calculating eyes. The past, it seemed, was not finished with them yet. Elena met the king's gaze, her heart steady. Whatever trials awaited, they would face them side by side. But as the stranger slipped away into the gathering dusk, a new question lingered in the air, one that would test the courage and love they had fought so hard to claim. The story was not over. The dawn had come, but the night was not yet done. The palace glowed with the warmth of new beginnings, but as dusk crept in, a hush fell over the halls. Elena felt at first a subtle shift, a prickle at the back of her neck, as if the shadows themselves were listening. The king noticed too, his eyes scanning the gathering gloom, his hand tightening gently around hers. That evening, as the palace dined together for the first time in years, the air was thick with hope and uncertainty. The king's words had planted seeds of trust, but old fears lingered in the corners, whispering doubts. Elena moved among the guests, offering smiles and comfort, her presence a quiet reassurance. Yet she could not shake the memory of the stranger's cold gaze, the way he had melted into the darkness like a secret. Later, as the moon rose high, Elena found herself drawn to the old library, a place of forgotten stories and silent wisdom. She wandered between the shelves, her fingers brushing the spines of ancient books, searching for answers she could not name. The king joined her, his presence a gentle anchor in the sea of uncertainty. He spoke softly, his voice echoing among the dusty tomes. I fear the past is not finished with us, Elena. There are those who would see the curse return who cannot bear the light we have found. His words were heavy, but his eyes were clear, filled with a quiet resolve. We must be stronger than their fear. We must show them that love is not a weakness, but a shield. Elena nodded, her heart swelling with pride and worry. We've come so far, she whispered. But what if the darkness comes for us again? The king reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. Then we will face it together as we always have. I am not afraid, not while you are by my side. Just then, a cold wind swept through the library, snuffing out the candles and plunging the room into shadow. Elena's breath caught as a voice, low and mocking, drifted from the darkness. You think love can break a curse, little queen? The night is not so easily tamed. A figure stepped from the shadows, the stranger from the hall, his eyes gleaming with malice and old pain. You stole what was never yours, he hissed at the king. The darkness belongs to me. The king stepped forward, shielding Elena with his body, his voice calm but fierce. No more fear, no more hiding. If you wish to bring back the night, you will have to face us both. The stranger smiled, cold and cruel, as the shadows thickened around him. So be it, he whispered. Let us see if your love can withstand the true darkness. The library trembled, the air crackling with ancient magic. Elena clung to the king's hand, her heart pounding with fear and defiance. The battle for the palace and for their future had begun, and the outcome was far from certain. As the shadows closed in, Elena's courage was tested once more, and the fate of the king, the palace, and their fragile hope hung in the balance, waiting for the dawn. The library shuddered as the stranger's magic swept through the room, turning the air cold and thick with dread. Books tumbled from the shelves, their pages fluttering like frightened birds. Elena pressed close to the king, her heart pounding, but she refused to let fear take her voice. The king stood tall, his shadow stretching long and regal in the flickering candlelight. You have no power here, he said, his voice steady, though Elena could feel the tremor in his hand. This palace is no longer ruled by fear. The stranger's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. You think love is enough to save you? You think kindness can undo centuries of darkness? He raised his hand, and the shadows surged forward, swirling around Elena and the king like a living storm. Elena's breath caught as the cold pressed in, but she remembered the warmth she had felt when she first reached for the king's hand, the way hope had pushed back the night. She squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his presence. We are not afraid of you, she said, her voice trembling but true. We have already faced the darkness and found the light. The stranger laughed, a sound sharp as broken glass. Then let us see if your light can survive the truth. With a wave of his hand, the shadows twisted, revealing visions from the king's past, moments of weakness, mistakes, and heartbreak. Elena saw the king's pain, the loneliness that had nearly destroyed him, the choices he still regretted. The king's shoulders sagged under the weight of memory, but Elena stepped forward, her eyes shining with compassion. "You are not your mistakes," she whispered, her voice carrying through the storm. "You are the man who chose hope, who chose to love even when it hurt. That is your true strength." The stranger faltered, the shadows flickering uncertainly. For a moment the room was silent except for the sound of Elena's heartbeat, steady and strong. The king straightened, his eyes meeting Elena's with gratitude and awe. "You have given me more than I ever deserved," he said softly. "You have given me a reason to fight." Together they faced the stranger, their hands joined, their courage shining brighter than any curse. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing, but the light between Elena and the king would not be broken. But just as hope began to swell, the stranger's eyes flashed with fury. "If I cannot have the darkness, then I will take your light," he roared, unleashing a final wave of magic that crashed over them like a tidal wave. Elena and the king held tight to each other as the world spun into chaos, the outcome uncertain, their love the only anchor in the storm. And as the night deepened, the palace trembled on the edge of despair and hope, waiting for the dawn that might never come. The storm of shadows crashed over Elena and the king, swallowing the library in a darkness so deep it seemed to erase the world. Elena felt the cold seep into her bones, the stranger's magic pressing against her heart, trying to smother every spark of hope. She clung to the king's hand, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The king's voice was a whisper in the void, but it reached her through the darkness. "Elena, remember the light, remember who we are." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair. Elena closed her eyes and searched for the warmth she had felt so many times before, the gentle kindness that had broken the curse, the courage that had carried her through every trial. She remembered the laughter in the kitchen, the softness in the king's eyes, the way hope had bloomed in the darkest night. She let those memories fill her until her heart glowed with a quiet, golden light. The stranger's voice echoed all around them, desperate and furious. "You cannot win, the darkness is endless, it will always return." But Elena opened her eyes, and in that moment she saw the truth. The darkness was not endless. It was only the absence of light, and light could always return. She squeezed the king's hand, and together they stood tall, their love shining like a beacon in the storm. The golden light grew, pushing back the shadows inch by inch. The stranger screamed, his form flickering and shrinking as the light exposed every hidden wound, every secret pain. "You cannot take this from me," he cried, but his power was fading, unraveling in the face of their unity. The king stepped forward, his voice gentle but unyielding. "You do not have to be alone in the dark," he said to the stranger. "You can choose the light too." For a heartbeat, the stranger hesitated, his eyes wide with longing and fear. But the pain was too deep, the anger too old. With a final, shuddering cry, he vanished into the last curl of shadow, leaving only silence behind. The library filled with golden light, warm and soft, as if the sun itself had come to rest within its walls. Elena collapsed into the king's arms, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of hope finally fulfilled. The palace was quiet, the storm passed. Servants and nobles crept from their rooms, drawn by the gentle glow. They found Elena and the king standing together, hand in hand, their faces shining with love and hard-won peace. The darkness had been defeated, not by force but by the quiet, unstoppable power of compassion and courage. The palace, once haunted by fear, was now filled with the promise of a new beginning. But as dawn broke over the horizon, Elena knew their story was not just about surviving the night. It was about choosing the light again and again, no matter how deep the darkness. And as the first rays of morning touched the palace, Elena and the king stepped forward together, ready to build a future where hope would never be forgotten and love would always find a way. The first light of dawn spilled through the palace windows, painting the world in gentle gold. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the hush that settled over every room. Elena and the king stood in the library, surrounded by the soft glow of morning, their hands still entwined. The silence between them was full, not of fear, but of gratitude and wonder. Servants and nobles gathered slowly, drawn by the warmth that now filled the palace. Where once there had been suspicion and distance, there was now a cautious hope. Some approached Elena and the king with tears in their eyes, offering quiet words of thanks. Others simply stood nearby, as if needing to see for themselves that the darkness was truly gone. The king addressed them all, his voice steady and kind. "We have all suffered under the weight of fear and old wounds, but last night we learned that even the deepest night can be broken by a single act of courage, a single spark of kindness. We are not the same as we were, we are stronger together." Elena watched as the people listened, their faces softening, their hearts opening. She saw the cook who had once scolded her for daydreaming, the gardener who had whispered old stories of curses, the young maids who had always hurried past the night guard's shadow. Now they looked at the king not with fear but with respect, and at Elena with something like awe. But the king's words were not only for them. He turned to Elena, his eyes shining with emotion. "You taught me that love is not a weakness but a strength. You reminded me that hope is worth fighting for even when it seems impossible. I am no longer the king I once was. I am better because of you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she smiled, her heart full. "We saved each other," she whispered, "and now we can help heal this place together." The palace began to change in small, beautiful ways. Laughter returned to the halls and music drifted from open windows. The gardens bloomed brighter and the kitchens filled with the scent of fresh bread and sweet berries. People lingered in the courtyards, sharing stories and dreams. The old wounds of the past did not vanish overnight, but each day brought a little more light, a little more trust. Yet as the days passed, Elena sometimes caught herself glancing at the shadows, remembering the stranger's final words. She knew that darkness would always exist somewhere beyond the walls, but she also knew that they were no longer powerless against it. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of color, the king found Elena in the garden, her hands deep in the earth, planting new roses. He knelt beside her, his presence gentle and sure. "There will always be night," he said quietly, "but now we know how to find the dawn." Elena looked up at him, her heart steady, "And we'll face it side by side." As the stars appeared overhead, the palace glowed with a quiet, enduring hope. Their story was not finished. It was only just beginning, a story of courage, healing, and the promise that love once found could light even the darkest night. And somewhere in the hush between day and night, the world listened, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The seasons turned and the palace flourished in ways it never had before. Where once there had been only echoes and shadows, now there was laughter, music, and the gentle rhythm of daily life. Elena and the king walked the halls together, not as ruler and servant, but as partners, each day weaving a new thread of hope into the fabric of the palace. The people, too, changed. The old fears faded, replaced by a quiet pride in their home and in each other. The king listened to their stories, their worries, and their dreams. Elena, once invisible among the staff, became a symbol of courage and kindness. Children followed her through the gardens, eager to hear her tales of the night the darkness was broken. Even the oldest servants, who had once whispered of curses, now spoke of second chances and the power of gentle hearts. Yet the memory of the stranger's final words lingered in the quiet moments. Elena sometimes wondered if the darkness would ever return, if another test would come. But each time doubt crept in, she remembered the warmth of the king's hand in hers, the way their love had turned fear into strength. She knew that whatever shadows might come, they would face them together. One evening, as the palace prepared for a festival of light, a new tradition born from their victory, Elena stood on the balcony, watching lanterns float into the twilight sky. The king joined her, his arm wrapping gently around her shoulders. Below, the people danced and sang, their faces aglow with joy. "Do you ever miss the quiet of the night?" Elena asked softly, her eyes reflecting the lantern's golden light. The king smiled, his gaze full of peace. "The night taught me many things about loss, about longing, about the strength it takes to hope, but it was the dawn that gave me a reason to begin again. And you, Elena, are my dawn." She leaned into him, her heart full. "We are each other's dawn," she whispered, "and together we'll keep the light alive." As the festival reached its height, the palace shone brighter than ever before. The people cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of hope. Elena and the king stood at the heart of it all, their love a quiet promise that darkness would never rule again. And so, the story of the lonely vampire king and the brave palace waitress became legend, not just for the magic that broke the curse, but for the kindness and courage that built a new world from the ashes of the old. Their tale was told for generations, a reminder that even in the deepest night, the smallest light can lead the way home. In the end, it was not the curse that defined them, but the love they chose again and again with every sunrise. And in the palace where shadows once lingered, the dawn always returned, brighter, warmer, and full of hope.